The air in the dungeon was a living thing, thick with the breath of forgotten deaths and the metallic tang of despair. It clung to Alara's skin, seeped into her threadbare gown, and tasted like grave dust on her tongue. The year was 1647, and outside these walls, King Louis XIV, a child king, sat on a gilded throne in a world she could no longer imagine. Here, in the subterranean oubliette of Château d'Amboise, time was a stagnant pool, marked only by the drip of unseen water from the vaulted ceiling and the distant, mournful chime of a bell she could not identify. It might have been a church bell or a clock tower in the distant town, or perhaps merely a figment of her mind warped by isolation. Each drip echoed in the cavernous space, a relentless cadence, measuring not hours, but the slow, agonizing erosion of her spirit. Her cell, no more than a crude cavity carved into the living rock, offered no solace. The stone walls wept a perpetual, cold sweat, forming glistening trails that snaked downwards, disappearing into the putrid straw scattered on the floor. A single high-slit window, barely wide enough for a raven to perch upon, offered a miserly shaft of milky gray light that never quite dispelled the gloom. It was a cruel mockery of the sun, illuminating only the dancing motes of dust in the stagnant air, remnants of a world that continued to turn without her. She rarely looked at it anymore. Its fleeting presence, the brief illusion of a connection to the world above, was more painful than the endless darkness. Better to embrace the void, to let the blackness consume her, than to be reminded of what she had lost. Ilara huddled on a pile of damp, vermin-ridden straw, her knees drawn up too, her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to keep her very soul from escaping. Her once vibrant auburn hair, now dull and matted, fell in greasy strands across her face, obscuring eyes that had once sparkled with defiance, but now held only a haunted, far-away look. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips chapped and cracked, and her fingers, once nimble and deft, were now gnarled and scarred from endless fidgeting and scratching at unseen insects. Hunger was a dull, constant ache in her belly, a familiar companion that had long since replaced the sharp pangs of early starvation. Thirst, however, remained a torment, a dry rasp in her throat that no amount of prayer or desperate swallowing could alleviate. Her tongue often felt like sandpaper, scraping against the roof of her mouth, and the very act of speaking, if she had anyone to speak to, would have been a painful ordeal. She had lost count of the days, the weeks, the months. Time in the abyss was not linear. It swirled and twisted, past and present merging into a single, unending moment of suffering. Was it spring? Had the crisp air of autumn already given way to winter's icy embrace? She remembered the last time she had seen the sky, a vast expanse of bruised purple and gray just before the heavy oak door had swung shut, swallowing her whole into this tomb. The memory was a shard of ice in her heart, piercing her with a fresh wave of despair. Each breath was a shallow gasp, each beat of her heart a weary throb against her ribs. But even in this desolate existence, one thought, one image remained, unsullied, fiercely guarding the last embers of her humanity, her son, Thomas. His face, a perfect miniature of her own, with those wide, inquisitive hazel eyes and a smattering of freckles across his nose, was etched into the very fabric of her being. She could still feel the phantom weight of his small hand in hers. Here, the ghost of his laughter echoing in the hollow silence of her cell. He was her anchor, the fragile thread that tethered her to sanity, the reason her heart still dared to beat. How old was he now? 6? 7? Had he forgotten her? Did he still ask for his maman? The questions gnawed at her, sharp as hungry rats, in the shadows, threatening to unravel the delicate tapestry of her resolve. She clutched the rough wool of her gown, imagining it was his small body she held, warm and trembling, pressed against her chest. She hummed a lullaby, a faint, reedy sound that was swallowed by the vast silence of the dungeon, but it was enough to conjure his presence, to feel a flicker of warmth in the icy grip of her fear. She remembered his bright smile, the way his eyes would light up when she read him stories, his soft hair brushing her cheek as she tucked him into bed. These memories, precious and agonizing, were her sole companions in the crushing solitude. They were also her greatest tormentors, reminding her of everything she had lost, everything that had been cruelly snatched away. The crime they accused her of was so monstrous, so utterly unimaginable, that even in the darkest corners of her mind, she could not reconcile it with the gentle life she had led. Sorcery, witchcraft. They had found the charred remains of herbs in her cottage, the strange symbols she had sketched in the dirt, the old woman's remedies she had kept from her. Grandmother. Innocent acts of healing and tradition twisted into instruments of the devil by their zealous, unyielding minds. The accusations had come swiftly, like a sudden storm, engulfing her and everything she held dear. It wasn't the herbs, she knew. It was something else. A flicker of defiance in her eyes, a refusal to bow to the local lord's demands, a whispered word of dissent against the new taxes. Or perhaps it was simpler, crueler still. Her small patch of fertile land, coveted by a powerful neighbor, her independence seen as an affront in a world that demanded subservience from women. She had seen it happen before, women accused for little more than having a strong will or a piece of property someone else desired. The church, ever eager to solidify its power, provided the perfect, terrifying framework for such appropriations. The fear of damnation, the specter of the Inquisition, was a tool sharper than any blade. Her trial had been a farce, a macabre theater played out in a grand hall where stone gargoyles watched impassively from the rafters. The air had been thick, with the scent of incense and fear and the whispers of the crowd. A mix of curiosity and condemnation had buzzed around her like angry bees. She remembered the cold, unwavering gaze of the Inquisitor, his face a mask of righteous severity, his voice a low guttural rumble as he recited the litany of her alleged sins. Every denial, every plea for reason, had been met with a scornful sneer, a dismissive wave of the hand. Her testimony, her truth, was swallowed whole by the overwhelming weight of their collective judgment. The truth, she had learned, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by prejudice and ambition. They had twisted her words, warped her intentions, painted her as a vessel of evil, a danger to the very fabric of their pious society. She had looked for a friendly face in the crowd, a flicker of recognition, a sign of compassion, but found none. Only fear and revulsion. Only one face had mattered, and he wasn't there. Her husband, Gaspar. He had been a man of gentle strength, a quiet pillar in her life. But when the accusations came, when the Inquisitor's men descended upon their cottage, like vultures, he had disappeared, vanished. At first, she had clung to the hope that he was seeking help, gathering support, preparing to rescue her. But as the days bled into weeks and then months, hope had curdled into a bitter, gnawing doubt. Had he abandoned her? Had he, too, believed the monstrous lies? The thought was a torment, a betrayal that cut deeper than any dungeon chain. Or was he dead? Captured? Imprisoned somewhere even worse than this? The uncertainty was a constant companion, a silent interrogation master in the cell, asking questions for which there were no answers. She hated herself for the flicker of resentment that sometimes flared, hot and sharp, in her chest. But then guilt would wash over her, cold and heavy, reminding her of the vows they had exchanged, the love they had shared. She pushed the thought away. No. She would not allow herself to believe he had abandoned them. Not him. He was a good man. He must have a reason. A sudden, jarring clang of metal from the distant corridor shattered her reverie. Her head snapped up, her senses dulled. By days of inactivity, suddenly hyper-alert. Footsteps, heavy, measured, approaching. The sound scraped against her raw nerves, a primal fear seizing her throat. This wasn't the usual guard bringing the meager ration of stale bread and muddy water. These footsteps were different, slower, more deliberate, accompanied by a faint, scraping sound that sent a shiver down her spine. A key rattled somewhere, then another, louder, closer. The air grew colder, if that were possible, and a sickening dread coiled in her stomach. This was it. The moment she had both dreaded and yearned for. The end, or perhaps something worse. A torchlight flickered at the end of the corridor, growing steadily brighter, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. It illuminated a figure, tall and imposing, draped in the black robes of the Holy Office. It was the Inquisitor. His face, etched with a grim satisfaction, was illuminated by the torch he held aloft. Behind him, two hulking guards, their faces impassive beneath their iron helms, carried something heavy, something long and dark, wrapped in rough canvas. Her breath hitched in her throat. She tried to scramble backward, to press herself further into the damp stone. But there was nowhere to go. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The Inquisitor stopped before her cell, his gaze sweeping over her, an expression of clinical disdain on his features. Raise the torch higher, its smoky flame casting her emaciated figure in stark relief. The world tilted on its axis. The dungeon, the cold, the hunger, all faded into a meaningless background hum before the searing, impossible reality of the Inquisitor's pronouncement. Thomas. He shall bear witness. It was a twist of the blade, a torment meticulously crafted to inflict the deepest possible wound. They were not merely punishing her body, they were assaulting her very soul, using the purest and most vulnerable part of her heart as their weapon. The guttural cry that ripped from her throat was not born of pain, but of a mother's primal, desperate fury, a sound torn from the deepest well of her being. Her emaciated fingers, skeletal and trembling, clawed at the iron bars, the rusty metal scraping against her skin, leaving thin red lines that she neither saw nor felt. Each word she uttered was a desperate plea, a ragged prayer to a God who seemed to have abandoned her. No, not him. Leave him be. He is innocent. He knows. Nothing! But her voice, weakened by starvation and disuse, was a mere whisper against the Inquisitor's chilling resolve, dissolving into hoarse, choked sobs that offered no release, only a further tightening in her chest. The Inquisitor, a black-clad monument to unfeeling piety, merely observed her agony, a thin, humorless smile playing on his lips. His eyes, devoid of any warmth, seemed to gleam with a dark, triumphant satisfaction. Her despair was his victory, her pain a testament to his righteous judgment. He gestured with a dismissive flick of his hand, and the two hulking guards, silent and impassive, moved forward. The heavy key grated in the lock, echoing like a death knell in the confined space. The door creaked open, exhaling a gust of dank, stale air. Ilara stumbled backward, momentarily disoriented by the sudden flood of torchlight from the corridor. Her legs, unaccustomed to movement, threatened to buckle beneath her. Before she could regain her footing, strong, unyielding hands seized her arms, dragging her roughly from the straw-covered floor. Her bare feet scraped against the rough stone, each step a jarring reminder of her captivity, her utter helplessness. The procession through the labyrinthine passages of the chateau's dungeons was a descent into a deeper hell. The air grew colder, the stone walls more ancient, more oppressive. The scraping sound she had heard earlier was revealed to be the wooden contraption, the stone coffin, being dragged along behind them, its crude frame echoing the relentless march of her doom. Torchbearers, their faces grim and unreadable, illuminated their path, casting grotesque dancing shadows that stretched and twisted, mocking her struggles. The smell of damp earth and decay intensified, mingling with the faint, cloying scent of frankincense that seemed to cling to the Inquisitor's robes. Each turn in the narrow corridor felt like another nail hammered into the lid of her own grave. She tried to resist, to dig her heels into the ground, but her strength was a phantom, dissipating with every forced step. The guards' grip was iron, their determination unwavering. She was a puppet, her strings pulled by unseen, malevolent forces. Finally, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air signaled their approach to the outside world. The oppressive, stagnant air of the dungeon gradually gave way to a cooler, fresher breeze, though it was still heavy with the scent of human bodies and the dampness of the morning. A distant murmur, a low hum began to penetrate the thick stone walls. It grew steadily, resolving into a cacophony of voices, 1,000 whispers and murmurs that swirled into a roar. The public square. They were taking her to the public square. Her heart leaped, a desperate flutter of hope mixed with unimaginable dread. Thomas. He would be there. She would see him one last time. The exit from the chateau's gates was a sudden, blinding assault on her senses. The murky gloom of the dungeons was replaced by the harsh, unfiltered light of a gray morning sky. Ilara squinted, her eyes watering, unaccustomed to such intensity after months of perpetual twilight. A gasp, a collective intake of breath, swept through the assembled crowd. The sound was a living entity, rising and falling like a tide, a mixture of curiosity, horror, and a chilling, almost palpable anticipation. Thousands of faces, a sea of anonymous humanity, stretched before her, packed tightly into the square, their eyes fixed on her, on the spectacle. Farmers in rough homespun, merchants in their finer woolen cloaks, noblemen on horseback observing from a safe distance, even children perched on their fathers' shoulders, their innocent faces wide with morbid fascination. They were all here, drawn by the macabre allure of a witch's public undoing, a spectacle promised by the church to cleanse their souls and reaffirm the power of God. The square itself had been transformed into a stage for her suffering. In the center, a crude platform of rough-hewn timber had been erected, draped in black cloth. Upon it stood the stone coffin, now fully revealed. It wasn't stone, she realized with a cold jolt, but a wooden framework, tightly bound with rusty iron bands, designed to hold a person upright. It was narrow, impossibly narrow, shaped like a human body with arms pinned to the sides, a cruel mockery of an embrace. The top was open, but the sides were solid wood, denying any view. The bottom was open too, leaving her feet vulnerable, a chilling thought she pushed away. Around the platform, armed guards formed a tight perimeter, their halberds glinting dully in the morning light. And then she saw him. A small figure, barely visible amidst the throngs, clutched tightly by a stern-faced woman in a dark cloak. Thomas. Her breath caught in her throat. His hair, a shock of bright auburn, still held the warmth of the sun. And his small face, pale and bewildered, was turned towards the platform. He was clutching a small wooden soldier, a toy Gaspar had carved for him. His knuckles white. His eyes, wide and searching, scanned the crowd, filled with a desperate confusion. He didn't see her at first, lost in the sea of faces. His gaze, not yet understanding the grim tableau before him. Ilara's heart seized in her chest. A choked sob escaped her, and she lunged forward, a desperate, animalistic cry tearing from her lips. "Thomas, my son! Maman is here!" The guards jerked her back, their grip tightening, almost crushing the bones in her arms. The Inquisitor, standing on the platform, raised a hand, and a hush fell over the crowd, a sudden, expectant silence that amplified the frantic beat of Ilara's own heart. His voice, resonant and cold, boomed across the square, amplified by the morbid stillness. "Silence! Let the will of God be heard!" Thomas, alerted by the sudden quiet and the sound of her voice, his name echoing faintly, turned his head. His eyes, those wide, innocent hazel eyes, found hers. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, a hesitant question in their depths. Then, as she was dragged closer to the platform, as the full horror of the scene began to register, his eyes widened further, filling with unshed tears. His lower lip trembled, and a small, whimpering sound, barely audible, escaped him. He didn't understand. Not yet. But he saw the fear in her eyes, the desperation in her movements, and an instinctual terror began to blossom in his young heart. Ilara was forced up the steps, her legs protesting with every strained movement. The wooden platform groaned under her weight. The Inquisitor stood beside the stone coffin, a figure of grim authority. "Ilara Dubois," he intoned again, his voice echoing, each word a hammer blow. "By the authority invested in the Holy Office, and in the presence of this congregation, you shall now enter the confines of your penance. Let your suffering be a testament to the righteous hand of God, and a warning to all who would stray from the true path." The guards roughly shoved her towards the contraption. It stood taller than she was, its dark, unvarnished wood ominous. As she drew nearer, she could see crude symbols carved into the interior, religious iconography mixed with what looked like curses. The air around it was heavy, filled with the faint, unsettling scent she'd noticed in the dungeon. Something, like old blood and dry rot. The opening was a tight squeeze. Her emaciated frame barely fit. Her arms were forced to her sides, her elbows bumping painfully against the rough wood. Once inside, the two halves of the coffin were brought together, forming a tight, inescapable embrace. The iron bands were then clamped shut, one by one, with a series of heavy metallic clangs that reverberated through the square and through Ilara's very bones. Each clang was a finality, a seal on her doom. The darkness inside was immediate, absolute. Her eyes, still adjusting to the daylight, were plunged back into an even deeper, more profound blackness. The air was instantly stifling, the smell of the damp wood and something else, her own fear, overwhelming. She could feel the rough, unyielding surface of the wood pressing against every inch of her body. There was no room to move, no space, to shift her weight, no way to even take a deep breath. Claustrophobia, sharp and agonizing, seized her. It was worse than the dungeon. This was a coffin of living wood, designed to mimic the grave while denying the peace of death. Her feet, bare and bruised, rested on nothing. The bottom was indeed open, allowing for maximum discomfort and exposure. She was suspended, held upright. By the narrow confines, her entire weight bearing down on her ankles and the balls of her feet, which now rested on small, sharp protuberances designed to prevent any relief. The pressure built quickly, a dull ache that would soon blossom into searing agony. She heard Thomas's faint, distressed cry from beyond the wooden walls, a sound that pierced the darkness and the burgeoning terror.